The gun was already pressed against Harvey Whitaker's temple when Lillian Shelton did the one thing nobody in the Red Mesa saloon expected. She pointed to the empty chair, not with fear, not with trembling. She pointed the way a woman points when she has already made up her mind about something that the rest of the world hasn't caught up to yet. Her finger steady, her dark eyes fixed on the man they all called the devil of the Cimarron Trail. The man with 3 counties worth of warrants pinned to his name. The man who hadn't sat down at a table that wasn't his own in 6 long years of running. "That seat's been empty all evening," Lillian said, her voice the quietest thing in a room full of held breath and cocked hammers. "Sit down before you bleed out on my clean floor." Harvey Whitaker had been shot twice in his life before that night. Once in Abilene, once in the New Mexico territory. He knew what a mortal wound felt like, and the graze along his left side that was soaking through his shirt in a slow, dark bloom was not mortal. Not yet. But the man behind him, the man who had tracked him across 400 miles of Texas and Indian territory with a bounty hunter's obsessive patience, had a Colt revolver pressed against the side of his head, and that was a different kind of wound entirely. That was the kind that ended conversations permanently. The bounty hunter's name was Dale Pruitt, and he was not a man known for hesitation. But something about the way Lillian Shelton looked at that empty chair made everyone in the room hesitate, including Pruitt, including Harvey himself, including the 3 ranch hands at the bar who had been slowly reaching for their own iron and now went very still. Harvey looked at the chair. He looked at the woman who had pointed to it, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, 6 years of living like a ghost, 6 years of belonging nowhere and to no one, 6 years of telling himself that men like him didn't get to sit at tables like that, cracked straight down the middle like dry timber. He pulled out the chair and sat down. To understand how Harvey Whitaker arrived at that moment, you have to go back 3 weeks to a morning in late October of 1878, when the wind off the high plains of the Texas Panhandle had teeth in it, and the sky was the color of a bruise healing badly. Harvey had ridden into the town of Calla Springs, New Mexico territory, on a horse that was better than he deserved, and with a plan that was worse than he should have trusted. The plan was simple in the way that plans made by desperate men are always simple. He had a letter. The letter contained information about a land deed that had been fraudulently recorded in the county courthouse in Santa Fe. A deed that had stolen 300 acres from a Comanche woman named Sunflower, who was the grandmother of a man Harvey owed a significant debt to. Harvey had obtained the letter through means that were not entirely legal, from a land agent in Amarillo, who had made the mistake of leaving Harvey alone in his office for 6 minutes while he went to fetch a bottle of whiskey. 6 minutes was more than enough time for Harvey to find what he was looking for, and considerably more than he had expected. The problem was that to get the letter to the right authorities, to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, Harvey had to pass through Calla Springs, and Calla Springs was Dale Pruitt's territory. Dale Pruitt operated out of Calla Springs the way a spider operates out of a web. He had informants at the stage station, the telegraph office, the 2 saloons, and both of the town's general stores. If a man with a price on his head passed within 20 miles of Calla Springs, Pruitt generally knew about it within half a day. Harvey had known this. He had ridden in anyway, because the alternative was a longer route that would have taken him through the Llano Estacado in late October, which was a kind of death wish he wasn't currently in the market for. What Harvey had not known, could not have known, was that Lillian Shelton had arrived in Calla Springs exactly 11 days before him, and that the Red Mesa Saloon, which had been a dying establishment under its previous owner, a man named Cobbs who drank more of his own inventory than he sold, had undergone a transformation that the town of Calla Springs was still adjusting to. Lillian had bought the Red Mesa from Cobbs's widow for $230, which was every dollar she had to her name after leaving Dodge City under circumstances she did not discuss with anyone. She had repainted the sign, replaced the cracked mirror behind the bar with a good one she'd freighted in from Albuquerque, hired 2 women from the Methodist Church to help her cook, and instituted a rule that no fighting would occur inside the establishment. The rule was posted on a painted board beside the door in letters large enough to read from the street. She had also added, in smaller letters beneath the main rule, a second statement that had caused considerable debate among the men of Calla Springs. It read, "All persons are welcome at this table regardless of origin, as long as they conduct themselves with decency." This was unusual. This was, by the standards of most places in the New Mexico Territory in 1878, fairly radical. It meant that the Navajo man who worked at the livery stable could come in for a meal without being turned away at the door. It meant the Chinese men who had been brought in to work on the railroad extension could eat at the same tables as the cattlemen. It meant the Mexican families from the south end of town did not have to send their food orders around to the back. Not everyone in Calla Springs appreciated this policy. Several men had attempted to explain to Lillian that she was running her business wrong. Lillian had listened to all of them with the particular patience of a woman who had been told she was doing things wrong for her entire adult life, and had stopped letting it alter her course. The Red Mesa became, within 2 weeks, the most talked-about establishment in the county. It was also, on the night Harvey Whitaker rode into Calla Springs with a bullet graze along his ribs and Dale Prout 3 hours behind him on the trail, the only place that still had a lamp burning. Harvey had not planned to stop at the Red Mesa. He had planned to water his horse at the public trough, buy a piece of jerked meat from whoever was still open, and keep moving. But his horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles out of town, and the smithy was dark, and the graze along his side had stopped being ignorable sometime in the last hour, and had started being insistent in the way that wounds do when they want your attention. And when he pushed through the door of the Red Mesa, and the warmth and the smell of actual food hit him, he made a decision based on his body's requirements rather than his better judgment. The saloon was not empty, but it was not crowded either. 2 men at the bar, a couple at a corner table, a card game that had wound down to 2 players who looked tired. And behind the bar, a woman with dark hair pulled back from a face that was striking without being soft, the kind of face that had been somewhere and come back with information it hadn't shared yet. Harvey had registered all of this in the practiced, involuntary way of a man who had survived 6 years on the run by never walking into a room without cataloging it. He had also registered the painted sign behind the bar that listed the items available for food and the prices, which were fair, and the second, smaller sign beside the door that he had read on his way in, and which had stopped him for just a moment longer than he expected. All persons are welcome at this table. He had not walked into a place that said that in a very long time. He sat at the far end of the bar, keeping his left side away from the light as much as he could manage, and ordered coffee and whatever was hot. The woman behind the bar, who he had taken to be Lillian Shelton without yet knowing her name, looked at him with the kind of directness that was neither threatening nor particularly welcoming, just honest, as if she was reading something and reporting the finding to herself. "You are bleeding through your shirt," she said. "I am aware," Harvey said. "The coffee is 10 cents, the stew is 15. I also have a sewing kit and carbolic acid, which I charge 25 cents for the use of, and I will tell you that the price is fair because a wound that size left unattended in this weather will be infected by morning." Harvey looked at her. He had not expected the directness. He had not expected any of this. "You do a lot of field medicine behind a saloon bar." "This is a new endeavor for me," Lillian said, and there was something in the way she said it that almost made him think she was being wry. "But I have a practical nature, and an infected man bleeding on my floor is bad for business." Harvey paid for the coffee, the stew, and the 25 cents for the medical supplies, and Lillian Shelton came around the bar with a kit that she handled with an efficiency that told him she had used it before, more than once. She did not ask him how he had gotten the wound. She cleaned it with the carbolic acid, which burned with the clean, honest fire of something doing its job, and she closed it with 4 neat stitches, and she did all of this without flinching, and without looking up at his face more than was necessary to gauge his pain tolerance. Harvey had not had anyone take care of him in a very long time. Not since his sister Agnes, who had died of fever in the winter of 1872, the same winter that everything else in his life had gone catastrophically wrong, and sent him on the road he'd been on ever since. The sensation of someone's careful hands attending to a wound was so foreign to him at this point that he had to look at the wall and press his jaw together to keep himself from doing something he would have been ashamed of. "What is your name?" Lillian asked, tying off the last stitch. "Harvey," he said. "Just Harvey, the way he always gave it, the first name only, the second name being the one that appeared on bounty notices." Lillian looked up at him then fully in the way she had not quite done during the stitching. "Harvey," she repeated. "I am Lillian Shelton. This is my establishment." "I can see it is," Harvey said. "There is a room above the saloon that I rent out," Lillian said. "It is $1.50 a week, which is expensive, but the mattress is good and I can have someone look at your horse's shoe in the morning. Ezra at the livery is here at first light." Harvey should have said no. He should have paid his bill and ridden on, horse's shoe or not, wound or not, because staying in any one place was a luxury he did not have and a risk he could not afford. He should have done a great many things differently in his life. "I will take it," he said, and hated himself a little for how much relief moved through him when he said it. He slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 weeks, and if he dreamed, which he rarely allowed himself to do, the dreams were not the ones that usually came to him. The dark ones. The ones that lived in 1872 and wouldn't leave. He woke before dawn, which was his habit, and lay in the quiet dark and listened to the town breathe around him. A dog barked somewhere. The wind moved along the eaves. Below him, he could hear the faint sounds of Lillian Shelton beginning her morning, the clatter of a stove door, the low singing that she apparently did when she thought no one was listening, something he couldn't quite identify that was not a hymn and not quite a folk song either, something in between, something that sounded like a woman making peace with whatever the day was going to bring. Harvey had not heard anything that beautiful in years. He told himself it was just sound. He told himself it was the relief of being warm and temporarily safe, and full of actual food. He told himself a lot of things that morning, lying in that bed above the Red Mesa Saloon, while the singing moved through the floorboards and did something to the calcified place inside his chest that he had been keeping locked since Agnes died. None of the things he told himself were entirely convincing. He came downstairs at a more decent hour and found the saloon empty of customers but occupied by Lillian, who was making bread at the end of the bar with the sleeves of her dress rolled to the elbows and flour on one cheek. She looked up when he came down the stairs and nodded at him the way you nod at a person whose presence you've registered and don't object to. "Ezra will be at the livery by now," she said. "Horse is in the second stall. He found the thrown shoe last night and left it on the rail." Harvey had not asked her to do any of that. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her and tried to find the angle in it because in his experience, when people did things for you that you hadn't asked for, there was always an angle. "What do you want for that?" he asked. Lillian looked up from the bread. There was something in her expression that was not offense exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. "I want nothing for it," she said. "Ezra is my neighbor and I asked him a favor. That is what neighbors do." "I am not a neighbor," Harvey said. "I am a paying guest." "Then consider it included in the rate," Lillian said, and went back to the bread with a firmness that indicated the subject was closed. Harvey went to the livery and spoke to Ezra, who was a quiet man of about 50 with hands the size of dinner plates and a gentle way with horses that Harvey appreciated. Ezra had already begun the reissue and said it would be done by noon, and that the rate was fair, and Harvey paid half up front the way he always did. On his way back through the main street of Calla Springs, Harvey noticed three things. He noticed that the telegraph office had a new notice in the window, which he did not go close enough to read, but which had the look of something official. He noticed that a man he didn't recognize was sitting on the bench outside the general store in the cold and watching the street with the specific quality of attention that belonged to professionals. And he noticed that there was a second horse outside the red mesa that had not been there before, a big roan with trail dust on its flanks and a rifle scabbard on the saddle. Harvey did not go back inside the red mesa immediately. He went around to the alley beside it and stood in the shadow of the wall and thought. He was probably already known. In a town this size, in a territory this connected, with Pruitt's network the way it was, his arrival last night had almost certainly been reported. The question was not whether Pruitt knew he was here. The question was how far behind Pruitt was, and whether the man currently sitting on the bench outside the general store was one of Pruitt's men or just a bored traveler. Harvey had made it 6 years by being a man who asked the right questions at the right moments and made accurate assessments. He assessed the situation now with the cold clarity that had kept him alive this long. His options were as follows. He could retrieve his horse now, shoe finished or not, and ride. He could stay in the red mesa and hope that Pruitt arrived after dark, when there would be more confusion and cover. Or he could do something he had never done in 6 years, which was trust another person with the truth of his situation and see what it got him. The third option was the one that terrified him, which meant, by the particular logic of desperate men and their choices, that it was also the one he found himself walking toward. Lillian was still at the bar when he came back inside. The roan's owner was at a table by the window, a rangy man in a good coat who looked up when Harvey entered, and then looked back down at his coffee with the deliberate incuriosity of a man who was being very curious indeed. Harvey sat at the bar 3 stools down from where he had sat the night before and ordered coffee, and when Lillian brought it he leaned forward and said, quietly enough that it didn't carry, "I need to tell you something about myself." Lillian poured the coffee and set the pot down and looked at him with those frank, dark eyes. "All right," she said. "My name is Harvey Whitaker." Something moved across her face, quick as a cloud shadow, and he knew she recognized it. Most people in the territory would have recognized it by now. 6 years of wanted notices put a man's name into the general vocabulary of a place. "All right," she said again, and her voice did not change in any way that he could detect. "There is a man who has been tracking me," Harvey said. "He will be in this town by tonight at the latest, probably by this afternoon. I have a letter that I need to get to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe. The letter is important in a way that I cannot fully explain right now, but I want you to know that I am not here to cause trouble for your establishment. I am here because my horse threw a shoe and you had a light on." Lillian was quiet for a long moment. The man at the window table shifted in his seat and Harvey kept his face very still and his attention very divided. "The man tracking you," Lillian said, "is he a federal marshal? He is a bounty hunter named Dale Pruitt." Lillian's expression did something complicated. "I know that name," she said. "Most people around here do." "He came through Dodge City 2 years ago," Lillian said. "He had a woman with him. He left without her." She said it flatly, stating a fact, but the weight of what she wasn't saying was considerable. Harvey looked at her. He was beginning to understand that Lillian Shelton had arrived in Calla Springs from Dodge City under circumstances she did not discuss, and that some of those circumstances might intersect with the name of Dale Pruitt in ways that made the geometry of this situation considerably more complicated than he had thought. "I am not a good man," Harvey said, because he believed in honesty in small doses, and this felt like the moment for it. "I have done things I am not proud of. I have not done the specific things I am most wanted for, but that is a distinction that doesn't carry much weight in a court of law." The letter I am carrying, if I can get it to Santa Fe, will correct a wrong that was done to a person who cannot correct it herself. That is the only thing I am trying to do right now." Lillian looked at him for a long time, long enough that the man at the window table had finished his coffee and left, which Harvey registered peripherally with considerable relief. "Can I see the letter?" Lillian asked. He had not expected that. He took it out of his coat pocket and set it on the bar, and she read it, quickly and thoroughly, the way a person reads who is accustomed to reading and takes it seriously. When she was done, she folded it exactly as it had been folded and slid it back to him. "Sunflower's Land," she said. "I have heard of this. The agent who filed that deed, his name is Raymond Holt, and he has been doing similar things across 4 counties. The Navajo man at the livery, Ezra's assistant, his family lost land to the same scheme last spring." Harvey stared at her. "You know about this already." "I know about a great many things," Lillian said. "I listen. People talk in saloons." She paused. "What I do not know is why a man with your specific history is the one carrying this letter." So Harvey told her. He told her about the debt to the man called Running Bear, who was Sunflower's grandson, and who had pulled Harvey out of an arroyo in the spring of 1876, when Harvey had been shot and feverish, and absolutely certain he was going to die there. He told her about the 3 days he had spent in Running Bear's camp, delirious with fever, tended by people who had no obligation to help him, and every practical reason to leave him where they'd found him. He told her that a debt like that was the kind you carried forever, and that when Running Bear had come to him 6 months ago with the information about the land deed, and asked if Harvey knew anyone who could get the letter north, Harvey had said that he would do it himself. He did not tell her everything. He did not tell her about 1872. He was not ready for that yet, and possibly never would be with someone he had known for less than 12 hours, but what he told her was enough. He could see it in the way something settled in her face, the way the last degree of wariness eased out of her posture. "Dale Prout," she said, "is not a man who will respect the property or the people in this establishment when he comes looking for you." "No," Harvey agreed. "Then we need to think about this carefully," Lillian said, and the "we" in that sentence landed on Harvey like a beam of sunlight through a February window, unexpected and disorienting and warm in a way that made him want to look away from it. The afternoon came in cold and bright. Harvey helped Ezra bring his newly shod horse to the stable behind the Red Mesa, and while he was there, he spent some time with the horse in the way that men who have been alone a long time often do with horses, talking to it quietly, telling it things he wouldn't say to a person. The horse, whose name was Obadiah, which was not a name Harvey had given him but had come with the horse when he traded for it in Tucson, bore this conversation with the equine dignity of a creature that has learned not to be surprised. Lillian came to the stable door in the late afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and a look on her face that meant she had been thinking. "I have written a letter to Judge Avery in Santa Fe," she said, handing him the coffee. "He is a federal judge and he is not corrupt, which is rarer than it should be. I know him because my father knew him, and there is history there that I can call on. If I send my letter along with the deed letter and both arrive by stage to Santa Fe, it will carry more weight than if the deed letter arrives alone." Harvey looked at her. "Why would you do that?" Lillian wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked out the stable door at the fading afternoon sky. "Because it is the right thing to do," she said simply, as if it were that easy. "The right thing to do often costs people something," Harvey said. "Yes," Lillian said. "It does." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that was both open and careful, the expression of a person who has learned to measure how much of herself she offers to any particular moment. "I came to Calla Springs because I needed a place where I could build something of my own, something that could not be taken from me the way things were taken from me in Dodge City. I put a sign on my door that says all persons are welcome at this table, and I meant it when I wrote it. If I let that be conditional, if it only applies to people whose stories are clean and simple, then it is not what I said it was." Harvey was quiet for a moment. "You are a more principled person than most," he said. "I am a practical person," Lillian said, which was what she had said about herself the night before, and Harvey was beginning to understand that this was not modesty. She genuinely believed that principles were practical things, that they organized the world into something livable, that they were tools rather than ornaments. He found this fascinating and somewhat bewildering, having spent 6 years in a world where principles were generally the first thing jettisoned when circumstances got difficult. They talked for a while longer in the stable, the comfortable, careful conversation of two people who are finding the edges of each other's thoughts, and when the sun went down and the cold sharpened, Lillian went inside to open for the evening and Harvey followed, carrying a kind of quiet in his chest that felt unfamiliar and slightly dangerous. He should have ridden out that afternoon. He knew it. Every practical, survival-oriented part of him had been saying it since before noon. He had his horse, he had the letter, he had the afternoon light. He should have gone. He had not gone. He had stayed, and he had talked to Lillian Shelton about Sunflower's Land and about Judge Avery and about the price of principles, and some part of him that had been asleep for 6 years or more had started to wake up with the particular uncomfortable urgency of something that has been still for too long. The Red Mesa filled up in the evening in the slow way of a weeknight. Cattlemen and ranch hands and 2 men from the railroad survey coming in for warmth and food. A woman from the hotel 2 streets over who sometimes brought her mending to the corner table because she liked the company without the conversation. Lillian moved behind the bar with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for years rather than weeks, and Harvey sat at the far end of the bar and watched her and ate his supper and tried to think about logistics and thought mostly about her. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Dale Prout came through the door. Harvey knew him immediately. He had never met Dale Prout in person, but the description was accurate and the bearing was unmistakable. A tall man in his mid-40s, weathered and precise, with the eyes of a man who had learned to see human beings as problems to be solved rather than people to be known. He had a deputy's badge on his coat, which was not the same as being a deputy, but which did the same conversational work in rooms like this one. 2 men came in behind him who had the look of men hired for their size. Prout's gaze found Harvey at the bar with the speed of a professional, which meant either he'd been watching the saloon and had seen Harvey through the window, or his informant network had already placed Harvey here. Both were likely. Harvey did not reach for his gun. He sat very still on his stool and made a calculation. The calculation included 6 people in the saloon who had no part in this and did not deserve to be caught in the middle of it. A woman behind the bar who had been decent to him, and whose establishment could be destroyed by what was about to happen if it went badly, and a letter in his coat pocket that needed to reach Santa Fe and couldn't do that if he was dead. Prout put his hand on his gun and said, "Harvey Whitaker, on your feet." The room went still in the particular way that rooms go still when iron enters the conversation. Harvey stood slowly from the stool, keeping his hands visible, and that was when one of Prout's hired men came at him from the right, faster than the situation had seemed to call for, and Harvey had just enough time to take the grip at the edge of it rather than the center, which was enough to keep him standing but not enough to keep him from catching the corner of the bar with his wounded side when he was shoved. The pain was extraordinary. It whitened his vision for a moment, and he grabbed the bar, and the graze that Lillian had stitched the night before tore open along one edge, and the room was now very loud and very chaotic. And that was when Prout got him by the collar and got the gun to his head, and said something that Harvey did not hear clearly because the blood roaring in his ears had gotten very loud. What Harvey heard, through the blood and the pain and the terrible focused stillness that comes to men in the moments when they are deciding whether they are going to live or die, was Lillian Shelton's voice. "That seat has been empty all evening. Sit down before you bleed out on my clean floor." She was pointing. Not at Prout, at Harvey. At the chair beside the table nearest the bar, the one that had been empty all night because people tended to avoid the table nearest the bar, it was too close to the movement, too much traffic. Harvey looked at the chair. He looked at Lillian. And he sat down. The logic of it was this. Lillian Shelton was pointing to an empty chair, and that was the same thing as saying you belong here. That was the same thing as saying this space was already yours. It was the oldest and simplest form of welcome, and Harvey, who had not been welcomed anywhere in 6 years, felt it stop him cold in a way that Prute's gun had not. Prute was confused by this, which was the point. Confusion was a moment, and a moment was enough, because while Prute was confused, Lillian was not. Lillian had already stepped from behind the bar to the space between Prute and Harvey's chair, which was either the bravest thing Harvey had ever seen in his life or the most reckless, and she was talking to Dale Prute in a voice that was completely level. "Mr. Prute," she said, "I know who you are. I also know that discharging a firearm inside a business establishment in the New Mexico territory is a criminal offense under territorial law, Section 4, and that any injuries or damages resulting from such a discharge are the personal financial liability of the person who fires. I know you know this because you are a professional." She paused. "I also know something else about you, which is that you were in Dodge City in the autumn of 1876, and that you had something to do with the circumstances that required me to leave that city." The room had gone so quiet that Harvey could hear the fire in the stove. Prute's face had done something complicated. The gun was still up, but his attention had fractured, which was what Lillian had intended. "You don't have anything on me," Prute said. "I have a letter," Lillian said, "from a woman in Dodge City whose name you will recognize, who has been waiting for a reason to send it to the territorial governor's office. She has been waiting because she was afraid. She is less afraid now that I am no longer afraid." She folded her hands in front of her with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial. "I am telling you this not as a threat, but because I believe in honesty, and I want you to make an informed decision about how this evening proceeds." Prute stared at her. Harvey stared at Prute. The two hired men looked at each other. It went on for approximately 15 seconds, which felt much longer than that. Then Prute lowered the gun, not because he was beaten, not because Lillian had evidence that could definitively destroy him, but because something in the way she stood there without fear and without malice, just with the absolute steady certainty of a person who knows exactly what she is doing and why, had taken the wind out of the room in a way that the gun hadn't managed. "I will be back," Prute said. "You are welcome to come back," Lillian said, "when you can conduct yourself with decency. That is the only requirement I have." Prute left. His two men followed. The door closed behind them and the room exhaled. Harvey sat in the empty chair with his side bleeding and his heart doing something it had not done in a very long time, which was trying to figure out where in the world it was, because it had lost its bearings completely. Lillian turned to the room, which was still frozen, and said with perfect composure, "Another round for the table. On the house." This broke the spell. Conversation resumed, uneasy at first and then, with the particular energy of people who have shared something dramatic and need to talk about it. Lillian came behind the bar and poured drinks and spoke to people calmly, and nobody looking at her from the outside would have known that she had just walked into the space between a gun and a man's head without any certainty at all about which way it was going to go. Harvey watched her do all of this and felt something happening in his chest that he did not have a word for, which was unusual because Harvey was a man who generally had words for things. After the room had settled, Lillian came to his chair with the medical kit again, and she sat across from him at the table and reopened the stitches with the same calm efficiency as before, and this time Harvey did not manage to look at the wall. "You did not have to do that," he said. "No," Lillian agreed, threading the needle. "You could have been killed. So could you. I am accustomed to the possibility." Lillian looked up at him then, needle and thread in her hand, and said, "No one should have to be accustomed to that." Harvey had nothing to say to that. It was the kind of thing that was true in a way that went down to the bone, and he had spent 6 years not letting himself think it, and hearing her say it quietly at a table in a warm room in a small town in the New Mexico territory undid something in him that he had not known was still capable of being undone. "What was it," he said carefully after a moment, "that Prout did in Dodge City?" Lillian was quiet for a moment, her hands still. "He had a partner," she said, "in the land scheme. Not the same one as Raymond Holt, a different scheme, something to do with water rights. The woman I mentioned, her name is Clara, and she worked in the establishment where I worked in Dodge City, which was not this kind of establishment. It was a different kind." She said it without apology or embellishment, as a fact. Clara gathered evidence against Prout's partner. Prout found out about it. He came to the establishment to discourage her from using it. He was successful in discouraging her. I was there when it happened. She said all of this in a tone that conveyed the outline without the details, and Harvey, who had seen enough of the world's darkness to read outlines, understood what she was not saying. "You helped her," he said. "I tried to," Lillian said. "Not enough. Not in time to matter, but enough to make my continued presence in Dodge City dangerous." She resumed the stitching with the same steadiness as before. "I took what I had and I came west, and I found this place, and I opened a business where the sign on the door means what it says." She tied the stitch. "And I have been waiting, I think, for an opportunity to use what I know about Prout, which is not the letter I told him about tonight, because there is no letter, but he does not know that." Harvey stared at her. "You bluffed him." "I extrapolated from available information and presented a hypothesis with confidence," Lillian said, and this time there was definitely something wry in her voice, the first time he had clearly heard it. Harvey laughed. He did not laugh often, and when he did it surprised him the way it felt, as if something rusted had been forced to move. "That is," he said, "the most impressive thing I have seen in a very long time." Lillian's expression, for just a moment, opened into something that was not quite a smile, but was the shape of a smile, the structure of one, as if a smile were a thing she had learned to hold in reserve and was considering deploying. "I spent 2 years watching men with cards in their hands," she said. "You learn how they signal confidence. You learn how to copy it." "You should have been a confidence woman," Harvey said. "I am a saloon owner," Lillian said. "The skill set overlaps considerably." Prout did not come back that night. Harvey stayed at the table long after the saloon closed and the last customer left, and Lillian sat across from him at the same table, and they talked in the way that people talk when the immediate danger has passed, and they are both surprised to be sitting across from each other in the quiet. They talked about Dodge City, and about running, and about the strange specific loneliness of being someone who cannot stay in any one place. They talked about the letter, and about running bear, and about Sunflower's land. And at some point, the talking shifted to things that had nothing to do with immediate practical problems, to things like what it was about the New Mexico territory that made the sky feel different from the sky in Kansas or Texas, and what it meant to build something from the ground up, and whether a person's history was the most important thing about them or just the loudest. Harvey talked more than he had talked to another person in years. He talked the way you do when you have been silent for so long that the silence has become its own kind of pressure, and something has finally released the valve, and the words come out not in a flood but in a steady, relieved flow. At some point after midnight, Lillian got up and went behind the bar and came back with 2 glasses and a bottle of the good whiskey, the one she didn't put out for general customers, and poured them both a measure and sat back down. "You could stay," she said. The words were simple, and she said them looking at her glass rather than at him, which was the first time she had avoided his eyes, and he understood that this directness cost her something, that she was not in the habit of saying things like this, that the habit was newer than the composure. "You know what I am," Harvey said. "I know what you have done," Lillian said. "I do not know what you are. Nobody does, including you, because you have been moving for so long you have not had the chance to find out." Harvey sat with that for a long time. "Prout will come back," he said. "Prout will come back," Lillian agreed. "And when he does, we will deal with it. We again." That small, enormous word. "You do not know what you are asking for," Harvey said. not as a warning, more as information, the honest kind. "I know exactly what I am asking for," Lillian said, and looked up at him, and the frankness of her gaze was something he could feel against his sternum like a hand pressing there. "I have been very careful for 2 years. I have been smart and I have been careful, and I have built something here that I am proud of, and I am not throwing it away by asking you to stay. I am asking you to stay because I think that the work I started here is the kind that is bigger than one person, and I think you have been useful in the world before, and I think you could be again." She paused. "I also think that the chair I pointed to is a more permanent offer than you've understood it to be." Harvey looked at the chair. The empty chair at the table in the Red Mesa Saloon in Calla Springs, New Mexico Territory, on a cold night in late October of 1878. He had sat in that chair because Lillian had pointed to it and something in him had broken open. He was still sitting in it. And the thought of standing up and going upstairs to the rented room above the saloon, and then the following morning retrieving Obadiah from the stable and riding out of this town and back into the long, formless years of moving, the thought of it was physical in its wrongness, a wrongness he felt in the same way he felt the wound in his side, present and specific and impossible to ignore. "The letter," he said. "I have to get it to Santa Fe." "We will find a way to get it to Santa Fe," Lillian said. "Judge Avery is real. My father did know him. The letter I spoke of to Prout may not exist, but the relationship does, and I can write to him and ask him to expect the letter and to act on it when it arrives." She folded her hands on the table. "There are ways to do the right things that do not require you to ride into danger alone." Harvey looked at her. He thought about Running Bear, who had pulled him out of an arroyo and kept him alive for 3 days without asking anything back. He thought about Agnes, who had kept him grounded until the winter of 1872, and about what he had been since he lost that grounding. He thought about 6 years of empty roads and cold camps, and the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with carrying yourself alone for too long. "I am not a safe person to be around," he said. "I am not looking for safety," Lillian said. "I am looking for something true." Harvey was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove had burned low and the room was cooling, and the night outside was still and full of stars that he had learned the names of years ago when someone had cared enough to teach him. He thought about the first night he had seen that painted sign by the door. "All persons are welcome at this table." "All right," he said. "I will stay." It was not a declaration. It was just 2 words said quietly by a man who was making, for the first time in 6 years, a choice based on something other than survival. But Lillian nodded as if she had heard everything in it. The way she listened to things, with the full weight of her attention, and poured them both another measure of whiskey. And they sat at the table in the warm, quiet saloon until nearly 2 in the morning, talking about nothing dangerous, just the ordinary things that people talk about when they have decided to stop being afraid of each other. The next 2 weeks were not easy, but they were real in a way that Harvey had forgotten things could be. Dale Prout came back, as he had said he would, on the 3rd day. He came alone this time, without the hired men, which Harvey read as either a tactical change or a different kind of conversation entirely. He came in the late afternoon when the saloon was open but not yet busy, and he sat at the bar and ordered coffee, and when Lillian brought it he said, quietly and without apparent heat, that he wanted to speak to Harvey Whitaker alone. Lillian said, with the same composure she had deployed on the first night, that there were no private conversations in her establishment, and that if he had something to say he could say it here. Prout looked at Harvey, who was sitting at his table, the empty chair that Lillian had pointed to having become, over 3 days, something that functioned as his place at the table in a way that Harvey had not consciously decided to let happen but had apparently done so anyway. "The letter you're carrying," Prout said. "The sunflower deed matter, I know about it." Harvey said nothing. "Holt is my associate," Prout said. He let that word settle. "I want to clarify something." I want to clarify that I had no knowledge of the specific fraud involved in the Sunflower deed. The scheme I was part of was the water rights matter in Dodge City. What Holt did in the territory was his own enterprise, which I was not consulted on and would not have approved. Harvey looked at him steadily. You're saying you want the letter to reach Santa Fe? I'm saying, Prout said carefully, that Holt's actions in the territory have created a legal exposure that touches my own business interests in ways I would prefer to correct before a federal judge becomes involved. And I'm saying that if you can get that letter to Santa Fe without further incident, I will withdraw my claim on you personally. The warrant was filed by a third party in 1875, and I have enough influence with the originating party to have it reconsidered. This was not what Harvey had expected. He sat with it for a moment, looking at Prout's face for the lie in it, the hidden motive, the trap, because that was the shape his experience had taught him to look for in an offer like this one. What he found in Prout's face was something more complicated than a trap. What he found was a man who had done a great many expedient things and who had arrived, at some point in the recent past, at a calculation that had shifted his position. Not because of morality, Harvey was fairly certain of that. Prout did not operate on the basis of morality. But because of exposure and fear, and the particular pragmatism of a man who has seen the ground shift under him, and has decided that the least costly route forward involves cleaning up certain messes before they spread. The woman in Dodge City, Lillian said, from behind the bar. Clara. Prout did not look at her. A slight tightening around his eyes was the only acknowledgement. I am going to write a letter to her, Lillian said. Not to the governor's office, directly to her. I am going to tell her that you have agreed to withdraw your interference in the deed matter as a matter of territorial justice, and that she should feel free to report your partner's actions in the water rights matter to whatever authority she chooses, since you have no objection. You will sign the letter. Prout was quiet for a considerable moment. That is more than I agreed to. That is what I require, Lillian said, before I agree not to write my own letter to the governor's office about certain events in Dodge City in the autumn of 1876. The bluff again. Harvey, who now knew it was a bluff, watched Prout's face and saw the moment when Prout decided it didn't matter whether it was a bluff or not. The calculus was the same either way. Prout signed the letter. He left Calla Springs the following morning and, as far as Harvey was ever able to determine, did not come back. 3 weeks after that, on a bright November morning that smelled of frost and wood smoke and the peculiar clarity of high desert air in autumn, Harvey rode to Santa Fe. He rode as himself, on Obadiah, with the letter from Running Bear and the deed information, and also with a letter from Lillian to Judge Avery that had been written with the precision and persuasiveness of someone who had spent years observing how power operated and had learned to speak its language. Judge Avery received both letters. He was, as Lillian had told Harvey he would be, not corrupt, which in 1878 in the New Mexico Territory remained a distinction worth noting. He read the deed evidence, he read the documentation of Holt's fraud, and he issued an order for Holt's arrest and the nullification of the fraudulent deed within 2 weeks. Harvey was present for none of this in person. He had left the letters with a reliable intermediary, a woman who worked in the territorial government offices and who owed Judge Avery a debt of the administrative kind, and he had ridden back to Calla Springs in the same careful, watchful way he had always ridden, checking every rise and every tree line, making no assumptions about safety. But when he came back into Calla Springs on a Tuesday afternoon and put Obadiah in the stable and walked in through the back door of the Red Mesa and found Lillian behind the bar doing inventory with a ledger and a pencil and a coffee cup that had been refilled several times by the look of the ring marks on the bar, and when she looked up and said, "Well," and he said, "Done," something that had been held taut in both of them released at the same time, Lillian set down the pencil. Harvey sat on his stool. She poured them both coffee, and they looked at each other across the bar with the particular expression of two people who have done a difficult thing together and are now standing on the other side of it. "Running Bear will know soon," Harvey said. "The Telegraph should carry the news within a week." "And Sunflower's family will have their land," Lillian said. "And Sunflower's family will have their land," Harvey agreed. They were quiet for a moment. "About staying," Harvey said. Lillian looked at him with those frank, steady eyes. "I have been trying to think of what I have to offer this place," Harvey said. "I am not a barkeeper or a cook. I can fix things which I understand is useful. I know horses. I know the territory. I know how to read people who come in looking for trouble, which I gather has some value in an establishment like this one." He paused. "I do not know how to be a fixed thing. I have not been one for a very long time. But I am willing to learn, if that is a project you would consider worth taking on." Lillian was quiet for long enough that he thought he had misjudged the thing completely, misread the invitation, constructed a story that existed only on his side of the bar. "There is a great deal of work to be done here," Lillian said finally. "The roof above the back room needs reinforcing before the winter is fully in. The supply agreement with the freighter is up for renewal, and I need someone who can read a contract without being taken advantage of. The sign on the door is fading and needs repainting." She paused. "I have been doing all of it alone, and it is a great deal." "Then let me do some of it," Harvey said. "Yes," Lillian said. "Let you." The winter of 1878 to 1879 was the winter Harvey Whitaker learned, or relearned, what it meant to be a person who belonged somewhere. It was not a smooth or comfortable learning. He was not, by nature or by years of conditioning, a man who found stillness easy. There were nights in January when the cold came down from the mountains with a fury, and he lay awake in the room above the saloon, listening to the building settle around him, feeling the walls and the presence of other people sleeping under the same roof as a constraint that pressed on something in him that still wanted to run. He did not run. He got up on those nights and went downstairs and made coffee on the stove and sat at his table, the empty chair that was no longer empty, and waited for the wanting to pass, and eventually it did. Not because it stopped mattering. Because other things started mattering more. He fixed the roof in December, working alongside two men from the south end of town, who Lillian had hired, and who regarded Harvey with an initial wariness that eased over 3 days of shared labor into something approximating tolerance. He renegotiated the freighter contract in January, sitting across from the freighter's agent at a table in the Red Mesa with Lillian beside him, and the agent, who had been overcharging Lillian by a margin that was not accidental, found himself agreeing to terms that were considerably more equitable than what he'd come in with. He repainted the sign. He mixed the paint himself, a dark red that matched the original color as closely as he could approximate from what the hardware store in town carried, and he painted the letters with the careful hand of someone who had once, in a life that felt like it belonged to a different person, learned to write well, and had not lost the skill. All persons are welcome at this table. He painted it and stood back and looked at it in the thin February sun and felt something that took him a moment to identify. Pride, shared pride, the kind that comes from having contributed to something larger than yourself, the kind he had not felt since a very long time ago. Lillian came to stand beside him and looked at the sign. "That is better than the first one," she said. "The lettering on the first one was uneven," Harvey said. "The W was too large." "I painted it myself," Lillian said. "I know," Harvey said. "It was still good." Lillian looked at the sign for another moment and then looked at him sideways, and the shape of the smile that he had been cataloging since October finally fully appeared, complete and real, and it was the kind of smile that reorganized the room around it. Harvey fell in love with Lillian Shelton in the way that things fall in the high desert, which is not gradually but all at once, after a long period of apparent stillness. He was not entirely certain when it happened. He had been moving toward it since October, he understood that. But the moment when he understood it fully, and without the possibility of talking himself out of it, was a Tuesday in late February, when a man came into the Red Mesa who was large and loud, and in the specific kind of mood that large, loud men get into when they have been drinking somewhere else first, and have come looking for an argument to use as an outlet for whatever is wrong in their lives. The man had directed the argument at the Navajo man, whose name was Thomas, who was having his supper at the back table. He had used language that Harvey was not going to repeat or describe, language that had no business being used about another human being, and he had done it with the confidence of a man who had done similar things many times before in places where no one had stopped him. Harvey was on his feet before he was aware of deciding to stand. He crossed the room in 12 steps and he stood between the man and Thomas, and he looked at the man with the absolute flat focus of someone who is not angry in the way that makes people loud, but angry in the way that makes them very quiet and very clear, and he said, in a voice that the whole room heard without him raising it, "You need to apologize to this man, and then you need to leave." The man looked at Harvey. He was bigger than Harvey by 2 inches and 20 pounds, and he had the history of a man who had used his size effectively. He looked at Harvey for long enough to make an assessment. Whatever assessment he made, he said, "My mistake," to Thomas, and he left. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Thomas said to Harvey, "Thank you," with the quiet dignity of a man who was accustomed to receiving neither apologies nor intervention, and who had not expected either. Harvey sat back down. He looked across the room at Lillian, who was standing behind the bar with her hands flat on it, and looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not the frank, assessing look of someone taking an inventory. It was something open and specific, and aimed at him in a way that made the back of his neck warm. He understood in that moment that he would do anything for this woman. That the 6 years of running had not killed the part of him that could feel that, and that the thing that had been growing in him since October was not gratitude or proximity, or the simple consequence of being warm and safe and fed for the first time in years. It was the real thing, the kind that had a person's name on it and wouldn't answer to any other name. He was terrified by this, and he accepted it at the same time, the way you accept a thunderstorm when you are out in the open and there is nowhere to shelter. You accept it because there is no alternative and because some part of you has always known it was coming. He told her in March, not with a speech. He was sitting at his table on a Sunday evening when the saloon was closed and Lillian was doing her weekly accounts at the bar, and she looked up and caught him looking at her in a way he had stopped trying to conceal, and she held his gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation to arrive. "I am in love with you," Harvey said. "I want you to know that. I am not saying it to ask for anything or to change what we have here. I am saying it because you told me you were looking for something true, and this is true, and it felt dishonest not to say it." Lillian put down her pencil. She came around the bar and she crossed the room, and she sat in the chair across from him at his table, the same way she had sat across from him on the first night, and she looked at him with eyes that were bright and serious and not at all afraid. "Harvey Whitaker," she said, "I have been in love with you since the night you told Dale Prute the truth about what you were without making yourself smaller to say it. A man who is honest about his darkness because he believes the person across from him deserves honesty is a rare thing. I have not met one before." Harvey was not a man who cried. He had not cried since Agnes died, and he had made a decision about it then, not consciously but in the practical way that the mind makes decisions about what it cannot carry. But something behind his eyes was doing something, and he pressed his jaw together and looked at the woman across from him at the table and said, in a voice that was steady by some effort, "I do not entirely know how to do this." "Neither do I," Lillian said. "Not the version that is real. I know how to do the other versions. The ones that are useful or strategic or survivable. I do not have much practice with the real one." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was the first time she had touched him since October, since the careful, clinical touch of the stitching, and the warmth of it traveled up his arm and settled in his chest like a coal set down in cold ash. "I think we learn it together." "Yes," Harvey said. "I think we do." Spring came to Calla Springs like it always does in the high desert, sudden and extravagant, the creosote blooming yellow and the sky turning a blue that had no gray in it at all, and the Red Mesa Saloon went through a kind of transformation that mirrored the season. Lillian expanded the food menu. Harvey built a second room onto the back of the building, working with Thomas and with a carpenter from the south end of town, and the new room served as a proper dining area separate from the bar, which brought in a different clientele during the noon hour. People from the church and the hotel and the school began to come in for the midday meal, which Lillian served at prices that were fair, and in a space that continued to enforce the rule about all persons being welcome. Word of the resolution of the Sunflower Deed matter came in April, carried by a letter from Judge Avery's office confirming that Holt had been arrested, and the deed nullified, and the land returned to Sunflower's family. Harvey read the letter sitting at his table on a bright April morning with the front door of the saloon open and the spring air moving through, and felt the debt to Running Bear finally settle into something that was not obligation but gratitude, the lighter kind, the kind you can carry without it bending you. He wrote to Running Bear. He had not written a letter in years, and the act of it was strange in the way that things you've abandoned are always strange when you return to them. He wrote what had happened and how. He wrote about Lillian, which he had not planned to do, but the letter was to a man who had saved his life, and it felt dishonest not to say that the saving had led somewhere. He wrote that he had stopped moving and that he was not certain yet what kind of person he would be when he was still, but that he intended to find out. Running Bear's reply came 6 weeks later and said, among other things, that Sunflower had asked him to convey her thanks to the woman who had written to Judge Avery, and that she hoped Harvey's woman was as fierce as the letter had been, because that was the kind of woman worth staying for. Harvey read this to Lillian at the table, and Lillian's expression did the full smile thing again, the one that reorganized the room, and she said that she thought she and Sunflower would get along very well. In May, Harvey went to the county record's office in the nearest county seat and sat with a lawyer Lillian had recommended and began the process of formally addressing the outstanding warrants against him. This was not a simple process. The original warrant, the one Pruitt had agreed to help withdraw, had in fact been withdrawn in early April, but there were 2 others from before that period, one in Texas and one in the Indian Territory, relating to incidents from 1873 and 1874. The Texas warrant involved a robbery that Harvey had been tangentially involved in, but had not orchestrated or profited from in any significant way. The Indian Territory warrant was more complicated and related to a situation that had begun as something else, and gone wrong in a way that Harvey had spent years trying not to think about. He told Lillian about both of them on a May evening when the new dining room was closed, and they were sitting at his table with the lamp low. He told her the full versions, not the outlines. He told her about 1872, about his sister Agnes, and about the circumstances of her death, which had not been an illness but something worse, something that had sent Harvey into a rage that had lasted 3 years and had resulted in several decisions that he could not undo and had not tried to. He told her about the robbery in Texas, which had been the result of that rage and that recklessness, and about the Indian Territory incident, which had grown out of a betrayal by a man he had trusted after he had stopped trusting himself. Lillian listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not qualify or reassure. She listened the way she always listened, with her full attention and without the management of her own reaction, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." "You needed to know it," Harvey said. "I know," Lillian said, "and I am glad you told me, and I want to tell you something in return." She folded her hands on the table. "The circumstances that brought me to Dodge City in the first place. I was 19 years old and I had no money and no family left, and I made a decision that I would later not have made. And I spent 4 years in Dodge City doing work that I would not choose again, and I survived it, and I learned more about how the world operates than most people learn in a lifetime. And when Clara was hurt and I could not protect her and I left, I carried that with me for 2 years as though it were a permanent verdict on what I was. She met his eyes, and hers were clear and steady and not afraid. I have decided it is not a permanent verdict. I have decided that what we do next is more instructive than what we did before, as long as we do not use the before as an excuse to stop thinking about what we owe. Harvey looked at her and felt the full weight of the life she had lived, and the choice she had made to build something from it rather than be buried by it. And the thing that moved through him then was not simply love but something more specific, the kind of regard that has a person's particular dimensions in it, the love that has been assembled from knowing someone truly. "I would like to marry you," Harvey said, "if that is something you want. I am not saying it because it is the expected next step. I am saying it because I want to make a thing that is permanent with you." Lillian was quiet. He waited. "Yes," she said, "that is something I want." They were married in June of 1879 in a small ceremony in the Red Mesa Saloon, which was decorated with wildflowers that the women from the south end of town had brought in baskets, yellow and purple, and a kind of fierce orange that looked like sunset against the painted wood walls. The minister was a man from the Methodist Church, who had been coming in for the noon meal since March and who had come to regard Lillian with the particular respect that pragmatic people develop for other pragmatic people. Thomas and Ezra and the carpenter and several of the regular customers were present, and the woman from the hotel with the mending came without her mending for the first time and cried in a way that she seemed surprised by. Harvey stood at the front of his own saloon, because it was his too now, in the good coat that Lillian had helped him select at the general store, and watched Lillian come down the stairs from the upper floor in a dress that was not white because she was a practical woman, but was the particular shade of blue that the desert sky went at noon, and he thought about the first night he had come through the door bleeding and without a plan, and about the sign by the door that had stopped him for just a moment longer than he expected, and about the empty chair. He had been sitting at that table for 8 months. He planned to sit at it for the rest of his life. The summer of 1879 was good. Not uncomplicated, because nothing in the New Mexico Territory in 1879 was uncomplicated, but good in the particular way that comes from having work to do and people to do it with and a place to come back to at the end of the day. The legal matters resolved slowly, the way legal matters did in that era. The Texas warrant was addressed in August through the combination of the lawyer's work, a sworn statement from a man who had been present at the robbery and who had more reason now to tell the truth than he'd had before, and the fact that the original complainant had died in 1876 and his estate had no interest in pursuing the matter. The Indian Territory warrant took longer and involved a journey to the federal marshal's office in the territory that Harvey and Lillian made together in September. Lillian having written ahead to a judge she had been put in contact with through Judge Avery's office. The Indian Territory matter was more difficult to resolve cleanly, because the man Harvey had been in conflict with had a family who still carried the grievance. Harvey met with that family, which was the hardest thing he had done since he had stopped running, harder than any physical danger, because it required him to stand still and receive the weight of what he had done without the option of riding away from it. He did not make excuses. He explained the circumstances fully, and he acknowledged what he had done, and he offered what restitution he could make, which was not enough and never would be enough, but which was real. The warrant was not fully discharged until the end of September, and even then it came with conditions that required Harvey to make specific restitution payments over time. He agreed to all of them without negotiation. Lillian did not try to negotiate them down either. which told him something he already knew about her, that she understood the difference between fairness and mercy and did not confuse them. They came home to Calla Springs in October, exactly 1 year after Harvey had first ridden into town, and the Red Mesa was full for the evening because Lillian had apparently, by some means that Harvey had not fully understood at the time, let it be known that they would be back, and the town had in some way decided to treat this as an occasion. Harvey stood in the doorway of the Red Mesa and looked at the room full of people, at Thomas and Ezra, and the women from the Methodist Church and the ranchers and the railroad men and the families from the south end of town, all of them at the same tables under the same roof, eating the same food, and he felt something that was not pride or happiness exactly, but was something older and more fundamental than either. The feeling of being in the right place. The feeling of having arrived somewhere that was his. He looked at Lillian, who was behind the bar talking to someone and laughing, the full laugh that he had not heard until May, and that still, every time, did the same thing to the place behind his sternum. She caught his eye across the room, and her expression said, without words, "Well, are you going to stand in the doorway all night?" Harvey crossed the room and sat down at his table, the one that had once been the empty chair she had pointed to on the worst night of his recent life, and Lillian came from behind the bar and sat across from him and poured them both a drink, and the room was warm and loud and full of people and belonging. The year that followed was the first full year of a life Harvey had not known he was capable of, and it built itself out of the ordinary materials of an ordinary life in an extraordinary place. He managed the repairs and the supply logistics for the Red Mesa and developed a working relationship with the freighter that involved actual mutual respect, which the freighter said was new for him, but that he found he preferred. He helped Thomas negotiate the terms of a better arrangement at the livery, which involved Harvey sitting across from Ezra's employer and deploying the specific brand of quiet, credible menace that he had refined over 6 years of surviving the frontier, but using it this time in the service of something that was not about himself. Lillian expanded the Red Mesa again in the spring of 1880. She added a post office service, handling mail for the south end of town that the official post had been slow to extend to, and the income from this was modest, but the goodwill was significant. She began teaching reading to a small group of adults in the dining room on Tuesday mornings, a project that had grown from a single conversation with a woman who had asked Lillian to help her read a letter from her son and had grown, in the way that Lillian's projects tended to grow, by the logic of need encountering capability. Harvey built the shelves for the classroom. He made them from good pine, measuring twice and cutting once, the way his father had taught him before everything went wrong, and when they were done, he ran his hand along the smooth edge of the wood and felt the peculiar satisfaction of a thing well made. He and Lillian talked about the future on the evenings when the saloon was closed and the town was quiet. They talked about it the way people talk about things they believe in, not with anxiety but with the pleasure of planning, of extending the line of something good outward into time. "I would like children," Harvey said one evening in the late summer of 1880, in the careful way he said things that he wasn't certain of getting right. Lillian looked at him across the table with the expression that was both frank and specific, the one that meant she was about to say something true. "So would I," she said. "I have been waiting for us to be settled enough to say it. Are we settled enough?" Lillian looked around the room, the clean bar and the good mirror and the signs and the shelves and the dining room through the open door. "Yes," she said, "I believe we are." In the spring of 1881, their son was born. They named him Thomas James Whitaker, Thomas for the man who had been their first loyal regular, and had become a friend across the barriers that the territory erected between people, and James for Harvey's father, who had been a complicated man, but who had taught Harvey to build shelves and to measure twice, and to love the specific weight of pine in his hands. Thomas James was born in the room above the saloon, with the help of the doctor from the next town and two women from the South End who had delivered children before, and whose calm, experienced competence Harvey was more grateful for than he had words to express. He sat outside the room and listened to the sounds of a very long night, and did not allow himself to think about what he would do if something went wrong, which was the particular discipline of a man who has learned that catastrophizing is a luxury that helps no one. When the door opened and the doctor came out and said the mother and the child were both healthy, Harvey sat for a moment with his face in his hands and let something that had been held very tight for many hours release in the privacy of that posture, and then he stood up and went in. Lillian was tired in the way that people are tired after a night of the most demanding work the body knows, and she was holding a very small person who had Harvey's dark hair and Lillian's specific look of someone taking stock of a situation and reporting the findings to herself. Harvey sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was a new person in the world, who had not yet made any decisions or carried any secrets or done anything to be forgiven for, who was entirely and utterly himself, and felt something break open in him that he had not known had been closed. "He is perfect," Harvey said. "He is very loud," Lillian said, with the exhausted precision of someone who has been listening to the loudness for some time. "But yes." Harvey took his son's hand, which closed around his finger with the automatic trust of a creature that does not yet know that trust requires evidence, and the trust of it, the sheer unpracticed trust of it, made him resolve in some wordless, complete way that this child would have every reason to keep doing that there would always be something solid on the other side of that reaching hand. The next years were the years that Harvey would, in his old age, remember as the substance of his life. Not the dramatic years of running and surviving and the terrible weight of belonging nowhere, though those years had their own kind of stark clarity. The years of substance were the ones that seemed small from the outside and were enormous from the inside. The year Thomas James said his first word, which was table, for reasons that everyone in the Red Mesa found deeply funny and which Harvey could not argue with. The year the school in Calla Springs was expanded, and Lillian's Tuesday reading sessions officially became part of the school's adult education program. The year Ezra retired and Thomas bought the livery and ran it as his own, which was a piece of justice so neat and clean that Harvey and Lillian celebrated it with the good whiskey on a Tuesday night. In the spring of 1883, their second child was born, a daughter they named Agnes Lillian Whitaker. Agnes for Harvey's sister, the one he had carried as a wound for 11 years, and now carried as a name for a new person who would not be a wound but would be, in the particular alchemical way of children given the names of the beloved dead, a kind of continued presence. Agnes Lillian was from the very beginning a person of specific and forceful opinions, and Harvey recognized in her a quality he recognized in her mother, which was the quality of a person who has decided that principles are practical things and organized her life accordingly. By the age of 3, she had opinions about how the tables should be arranged in the dining room. By the age of 5, she had opinions about the reading lessons and had appointed herself a junior instructor. Lillian watched this development with an expression of bemused recognition. Harvey watched it with an expression of absolute delight. Clara came to Calla Springs in the spring of 1884. She came from Dodge City, finally, after the letter that Lillian had maintained a correspondence with her about over 4 years. Letters that had been patient and persistent, and had carried the message that things had changed and would continue to change, and that there was a place here if she wanted it. Clara was 32 years old and had been in Dodge City for all of those years, surviving in ways that had left marks, and when she came through the door of the Red Mesa on a May afternoon she looked at the sign, "All persons welcome at this table," and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in. Lillian came from behind the bar and embraced her, and Harvey, who had been building a shelf in the back, came out to the dining room and was introduced, and they sat at the table, The four of them, including Thomas, who had come in from the livery and had coffee and talked. And Clara did not cry until the children came downstairs. Thomas James, who was 3, and Agnes Lillian, who was just turned 1. And when Thomas James climbed into his father's lap, with the complete absence of deliberation that characterizes very young children deciding where they belong, Clara looked at this and pressed her hand over her mouth and cried. After a while she stopped crying and apologized, and Lillian said there was nothing to apologize for. Clara stayed in Calla Springs. She helped at the Red Mesa and eventually took over the bookkeeping, which freed Lillian for other things, specifically for the expansion of the reading program and the correspondence she maintained with Judge Avery's office about ongoing land fraud in the territory. Lillian Whitaker became, over the following years, someone whom people in the territory brought land disputes to, not as a lawyer but as a person who knew the system and knew how to move within it, who could read a contract and identify the language that was hiding something, who could write a letter that carried weight. Harvey was proud of this in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with witness, the pride of a person who has been present at the unfolding of something true. In the fall of 1885, a message came from Running Bear. The message said that he was traveling north and would pass through Calla Springs in October if the Whitakers were willing to receive him. Harvey wrote back the same day to say that they were. Running Bear came with 2 members of his family, and they stayed for a week. The Red Mesa, which had been accustomed to mixed company since its founding, received them with the matter-of-fact welcome of a place that had long since decided what it was, and Sunflower, who had come along at the age of 74 with the bearing of someone who has outlasted several kinds of difficulty, sat at the table and ate Lillian's cooking, and looked at the dining room full of people, and said something to Running Bear that Running Bear translated as, "She says this is the way it should be." Harvey sat across from Running Bear at the table, the one that had once been the empty chair, and they talked for a long time about what had happened in the 9 years since the arroyo, about what had been built and what had been lost, and what was still being worked on. Running Bear's English was good, and Harvey's understanding of the things that did not need words was better than it had been in 1876. Before they left, Sunflower said something else, and Running Bear translated it as, "She says to tell you that you are a person who was found in the right place. She says that is not common." Harvey thought about this for a long time after they left. Found in the right place. The arroyo in the spring of 1876 had not been the right place, but the road away from it had, eventually, taken him to a door with a light on in a cold October night, and a woman who had pointed to an empty chair and said with that gesture everything that a man who had been nowhere for 6 years needed to hear. The 1880s built themselves into a life that was solid and varied and full of the kind of texture that comes from staying, from being known, from being the kind of people that a community counts on. Thomas James grew into a boy who was curious and methodical, who liked horses and arithmetic, and who showed, by the age of 7, a capacity for reading people that Harvey recognized as a skill he had passed down without intending to, though in Thomas James it manifested as empathy rather than the survival mechanism it had been in Harvey, which Harvey considered an improvement. Agnes Lillian grew into a girl who was, as Harvey had observed early, a person of specific and forceful opinions, who was going to do whatever she decided to do regardless of what anyone told her was appropriate, and who Harvey suspected was going to change something, someday, in ways that would be considerable. He was entirely fine with this. A 3rd child came in the spring of 1887, a boy they named William Arthur Whitaker, for no one in particular but for the sake of naming him something that fit his particular kind of presence, which was different from either of the others, quieter and more watchful, the kind of child who misses nothing and says little and stores everything. 3 children and a saloon and a dining room and a reading program, and a correspondent relationship with a federal judge's office, and a livery operated by a Navajo man and a cook who had come from Dodge City with bruises she had mostly healed from. This was what Harvey Whitaker's life looked like 10 years after he had ridden into Calla Springs on a horse with a thrown shoe and a bullet graze and a letter that needed to go somewhere. He thought about it sometimes, the contingency of it. The thrown shoe. If the shoe had not been thrown, he would have passed through Calla Springs without stopping. If he had passed through without stopping, he would have ridden north in the dark and either made it to Santa Fe or been caught by Prout outside the town. And neither of those outcomes included this table, this room, this family, this life. He mentioned this to Lillian one evening, the contingency of it, and Lillian, who was feeding William Arthur and looking at Harvey with the full, specific attention she gave to everything, said, the shoe was going to come off sooner or later. Obadiah had been favoring that foot for 3 days. The only contingency was where. Harvey looked at her. You noticed that? I notice things, Lillian said. That is one of my primary qualities. It is, Harvey agreed, among many. Lillian's expression did the full smile thing, the one that still reorganized the room even after 10 years, even after 3 children and 10 years of daily proximity, even after all of it. Harvey looked at her and thought about the sign on the door and the empty chair and the woman who had pointed to it without flinching, and felt the thing he had been feeling for 10 years, which had no single name but which was made of gratitude and admiration and desire and belonging, and the specific, private joy of knowing a person truly. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, in the exact same gesture she had made in the winter of 1878 at this same table when she had said, I think we learn it together, and she turned her hand over and held his. The Red Mesa Saloon stood in Calla Springs, New Mexico territory, for many years after that. The sign by the door was repainted 3 times over the years, each time in the same dark red letters on the same white board, each time by Harvey's hand, and each time it said the same thing. All persons are welcome at this table. The sign became, over time, a thing that people pointed out to visitors. That is the Red Mesa, the Whitaker place. The sign means what it says. Harvey Whitaker's legal record was finally cleared in full in 1892, through a combination of the restitution payments having been completed, the advocacy of Judge Avery's office, and the fact that 2 of the 3 territories involved had, by that year, become interested in demonstrating the operation of a reformed and functional legal system, rather than the perpetuation of old grievances. Harvey was 51 years old when the last warrant was discharged, and he received the paperwork at the table in the Red Mesa on a Tuesday morning, which was becoming a day associated, in the Whitaker family, with important things. Lillian read the paperwork with him, her shoulder against his, and when it was done she set it down on the table and said, There, now it is official. It has been official for a long time, Harvey said. The feeling of it, yes, Lillian said. Now the paper agrees. Thomas James was 11 that year, and Agnes Lillian was 9, and William Arthur was 5, and they were all in the dining room with their afternoon lessons when Harvey folded the legal paperwork and put it in the box he kept in the back room, where he kept the important papers, the letter from Running Bear and the copy of Judge Avery's order and the record of the restitution payments and the deed for the Red Mesa, which had been in Lillian's name and which, in 1880, she had redone jointly. He stood in the back room with the box for a moment, alone, and thought about the man who had ridden into this town 14 years ago, the man who had been so entirely convinced that men like him did not get to sit at tables like that, who had been so certain that the best he could do was keep moving, and hope the moving was fast enough to stay ahead of everything that wanted to catch him. He thought about the empty chair. He thought about the woman who had pointed to it, not with fear, not with calculation, but with the absolute steady certainty of a person who has decided what is true and is acting on it. Harvey put the lid on the box and went back out to the dining room where his children were doing their lessons, and the afternoon light was coming in through the windows that he had replaced with better glass the previous spring. And he sat at the table, his table, the one that had once been the empty chair, and Lillian looked up from the accounts she was reviewing at the bar and met his eyes across the room. There was a language between them by now that did not need words. The language of 10 years and 3 children, and everything built and rebuilt and tended and fought for. The language of 2 people who had chosen each other with full information about what the choice contained. She looked at him with that language, and he looked back with it, and the children scratched their lessons, and the fire in the stove gave its clean, domestic warmth, and the sign by the door said what it had always said, and the empty chair at Harvey Whitaker's table in the Red Mesa Saloon had not been empty in a very long time. It would not be empty again.